Welcome to Wildlife Rehabilitation from Rescue to Release, a podcast dedicated to licensed wildlife rehabilitators and the veterinarians who support them. I'm your host, Gail Buell. Techniques we discuss here are meant for licensed wildlife professionals. If you aren't licensed and trained for wildlife rehabilitation, do not attempt to rehabilitate any wild animal. If you do find an injured wild animal, a wildlife professional can recommend next steps. We'll tackle topics about rescue, care, management, reconditioning, and releasing wildlife found in North America. This is a deep dive into each subject. We hope to give rehabilitators information they can use because they're already going to great lengths to rescue and nurse animals back to health. There are 3 possible outcomes in wildlife rehabilitation: release, euthanasia, and placement. An injured or orphaned wild animal's journey to restored health and independence is delicate and complex. We draw techniques and expertise from many disciplines. Many animals brought into rehabilitation cannot be saved. The last gift we can give them is humane euthanasia. We will talk more about when this is necessary. Sometimes animals are deemed non-releasable and evaluated to be suitable for a life in captivity. When that happens, we shift to a long-term approach to managing their care, training, and housing. These animals serve as ambassador animals, a term for the animals that rehabilitators use to educate the public. Each episode, we'll speak with experts who represent specialty topics across the profession of wildlife rehabilitation and ambassador animal care and management, showcasing best practices. Welcome back to the third and final part of my in-depth discussion with Raptor expert Lori Arent. In episodes 10 and 11, we discussed how her unique background in physiology, biology, volunteer work with raptors, and becoming a falconer shaped her career. In this episode, we dig into the nuts and bolts of reconditioning raptors to ready them for release. Understanding species differences, Creance flying equipment, and techniques is just the beginning of this great discussion, so let's dive right in. What kind of equipment do you need specifically to fly exercise birds, raptors?
Okay, so there's a couple things that you need to exercise raptors. One basically is a pair of jesses. There's several different types that you can use, but the Raptor Center prefers to use what are called traditional jesses, which are very easy to make. So you just have to, purchase some leather and you can make them yourselves. They are a type of jess where they're just one single strap, and they have slits, 2 different slits that are on one end, and then there's one slit that's on the other end. And you attach it to the lower leg of a raptor using the end that has the 2 slits. And then the Creance will attach to the other slit.
Okay. And I would imagine the leather, it's soft.
Yes.
I know that raptor legs are very tough. They've got those very thick scales, but it still helps protect the leg. And you attach a jess to each leg?
Correct. So first of all, we like to use cow leather because we like them to be sustainable. There are some other leathers that are thinner, like kangaroo, which I know people use sometimes for their education raptors. But we choose not to use those just because of the frequency with which we're putting them on and off, that we just feel that we want something a little bit thicker.
Right.
But it's still soft. Cow is still extremely soft. And it's really important that you maintain the jesses too, so that you not lubricate them, that you
condition them,
yes,
right?
Yes.
You're conditioning them, right?
Right, you condition them on a regular basis to keep them soft and supple. And then as you're doing that, it also kind of forces you to check to make sure there aren't any wear spots that are developing. So the pair of jesses, one will go on each leg, and they should be the same length, because what you're going to do is you're going to attach a Creance to those 2 jesses. And so you want them to be the same length, so that they're the same distance essentially hanging from the leg.
I would imagine that helps keep their whole body in alignment as they're flying, because they're dragging basically, or pulling, or however you want to say it, the line. So yeah, we want to keep that even.
Exactly.
So, okay, excellent.
So there's the pair of jesses. We do not recommend using a swivel in between the jesses and the leash. So the purpose of a swivel is mostly to prevent tangling if you are going to tether a bird to a perch. But for this purpose, there's no tangling that is involved, and a swivel will just add extra weight.
Right.
And so we just will attach the Creance directly to the jesses. The other thing I want to point out is that we put the jesses on only during the exercise sessions. And that's one of the nice things about the traditional jesses, is that they're very easy to put on and to take off. And the reason we do that is because these birds, when they're being exercised, should be in some type of free loft. So a free loft is a space where a raptor can fly at least between two perches. And it's also tall enough that it can go from the ground at least to like a 6-foot high perch. So those are kind of two conditions.
Okay.
And if you have a bird that is free to move around in a space like that, there's always the risk that something somehow will get it caught with that slit that's on the lower part of the jess if you leave them on. You know, and it has happened to people. You know, they'll leave jesses with slits on, and there'll be some little nail sticking out from somewhere, and inevitably that slit will get caught on the nail, and the bird will hang. Yeah. So just to be safe, we put them on, we take them off. Another reason is because a lot of times we will house more than one bird of the same species together in a free loft.
Okay.
And then if there's stuff hanging, it tends to attract attention from one to another, especially if a bird is mentally hungry. You know, now they're not going to be physically hungry in rehab. You know, most often they're overweight. Right. But they get bored. You know, and it's like, oh, I wonder if it's feeding time. Oh, do you have something? Because there's something hanging from your legs.
Right, and movement is attractive too to a predator. So, it's moving over there. What is that?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the whole point there is we put them on when we take the birds out to exercise, and we take them off when they're in their free loft. So then, in addition to the jesses and the Creance, if you're going to be carrying your raptor out to the flight space, we have a field here that's very close, and so we do not put our patients in any type of travel box. We'll just carry them there. So if we're carrying multiple birds out at the same time, we only have a couple of Creances, so we can't attach a Creance directly to each bird. So then we use what's called an extender. And basically it's just like a 3-foot piece of the Creance that has a loop on each end, and we attach one loop to the jesses, and then the other end gets like attached to the handler's arm. Just so that if the handler would go down, the bird is not going to escape. And then when we get out to the field, it's really easy to transfer a Creance from one bird after we're finished to another, because we just attach it to the remaining loop, right? We untie it from the person's arm, and then there's an exposed loop. Right.
You're really kind of planning for the worst case scenarios, but expecting the best.
Exactly.
And looking at the equipment you have and the amount of equipment you have and saying, okay, how can we make this most efficient, but also the most safe?
And then, of course, there's the Creance. And there's a couple different types of Creance that we use, and it depends on the species. So we have I think it's like a 200-foot length of climbing rope, which is our primary Creance that we use for a lot of the medium-sized raptors, the great horned owls, the red-tailed hawks. We have the same size but longer length, like 300 to 400 feet for bald eagles. We have fishing line. So for the smaller species, usually it's those that are less than 600 grams. There's too much drag that's created by 200 feet of the climbing rope. So we use fishing line.
Okay, yeah, I can see them not being able to even get off the ground at the end of that line.
Exactly.
I can't do this.
So what we've come with, and we've used this for a very long time, is we use Tough Line XP fishing line. It's a braided Dacron, so it's very flexible. You know, it's not stiff like some other fishing lines are. And it's a 100-pound test strength. So
Okay.
we'll use those for small species. We'll also use those for peregrine falcons, both males and females. Some of the larger owls that have very low wing loading, such as great gray owls. And sometimes if a bird is having a hard time, at least to start getting off the ground, like even a male red-tailed hawk, we will try to put it on the fishing line and see if that makes a difference, or if there's another reason why that bird is not gaining lift.
Sure. That does give you options, doesn't it?
It does.
Having two different types of line.
Well, and actually, there's a third one that's kind of in between that we don't use quite as often, but we do have it available, and that is kite string.
Oh,
So kite
interesting.
string is not quite as thick in diameter as our climbing rope is. So we use, I think it's 3/8 inch diameter climbing rope.
Okay.
And so the kite string is, I don't know, it's just like 3 or 4 millimeters. And then, so that kind of is in between the diameter of the fishing line and the climbing rope.
Okay. And about the same length you're trying to use for the kite string.
Exactly.
Where do you get the climbing rope? Is it like just like at an outdoor store?
Exactly.
Or?
Yeah,
Okay.
and you can,
Okay.
you can probably get it on Amazon, like everything else.
And the fishing line,
The
is
fishing
it,
line too.
maybe it doesn't even matter. Is it deep sea fishing line?
Yes.
Is it freshwater fishing? Oh, it's deep sea fishing. So,
It is.
oh my gosh. So even probably is better in the elements because it's designed to be in saltwater.
Correct. And we also will mount the fishing line on a deep sea spool.
Do you use a
fishing reel.
You've got the rod and you've got the reel for deep sea fishing. Do you use the entire length of the rod?
No, we use an ice fishing pole. So an ice fishing pole is only, 2 feet long,
Sure.
something like that. So it's a lot easier than taking, a huge 6 or 8 foot. I don't know, I'm not a fisher person, but I know those regular rods can be really long.
Right.
So we
right.
just-
That's what I was thinking too. I'm like, set the drag, I do a lot of fishing. Like, oh, yeah, that'd be very different in the air than in the water. Okay, so we have jesses. We have an extender between the jesses and the Creance, and then we attach the Creance line, whatever material we're using, then to that extender. Is it kind of looped through too? So are you knotting it? Are you kind of looping it through?
You loop it through. So there's a loop at the end of the extender, and you almost make like a slip knot. You're putting it through the 2 slits on the jesses, or the loop on the extender if you need an extender. And then you pass that big loop over the reel that you have the Creance mounted on,
Okay.
and then you pull it snug. So it's really easy to take on, or to put on and to take off.
Okay. Makes sense. And you still, you don't have to keep cutting the line off so you don't get shorter and shorter lines. So get good, resource management. Okay, so we've got all of this connected. We have our trained volunteers. Now, is there any other equipment you mentioned? Or maybe you didn't mention when we carry them out to the field, or the place that we're going to be exercising them. Is the head covered with the bird?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So kind of reducing the stimulus, reducing some of the possible stress from looking at all kinds of stimulus. Can you describe what kinds of characteristics you're looking for in the place you're flying?
Yes, that is the last piece of what I term equipment that you need. And for many people, this can be the hardest one. So you want a suitable space that has the diameter so that your bird could fly 200 feet. Or in the case of eagles, as I said, we like to fly them longer. They're long-winged, bigger-bodied birds, so 300 to 400 foot space. And that really has to be in a diameter because you never know which direction the bird is going to fly. And the direction it's going to fly will totally be based on the direction of the wind on any given day. So you want to make sure that you have a large enough space. It's obstacle-free. So there can be things on the perimeter, but certainly not in the center that the birds are going to have to fly around. You want the surface to also be somewhat smooth. So, grass that is mowed works well, sand works well. Unfortunately, a lot of people do it in fields where there's a lot of weeds and, kind of woody vegetation.
Stubbly things, yeah.
Yeah, and then it gets stuck. The line gets stuck. It's doable, but it's more of a challenge that way.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, you want to make sure that it's an area that's not visited by people. It's not a public area, so a local park or something would be off limits, unless you know there's a time when it's not used very heavily at all. Mm-hmm. Then it would be acceptable. So again, it's a situation where you want kind of a private, large space that's obstacle-free and has a good substrate. Mm-hmm. And then also you want to make sure too, if you can, that there's going to be limited unwanted visitors, is what I'm going to call them. So, that there aren't stray cats or dogs off leashes or even aerial visitors, which can be challenging. There are wild raptors around, and as we're exercising our birds, even here on campus, sometimes we have, red-tailed hawks that'll come in and perch on the edge of the field. So our field basically is large, but it's bordered by trees on most sides, and so perfect spot for these wild raptors to perch. And sometimes they will, make a kind of false attempts at coming down and interacting with our birds. That's one reason why we no longer will exercise the small raptors outside.
Oh.
So we use our 50-foot indoor flight hall.
Sure.
However, I will say if we at all question their ability to use the wind in order to fly, to do the things and maneuvers that they need to make, we will take them outside. But then we literally have a ring of like 5 or 6 people that surround the whole field, and their job is to keep their eyes to the sky. And if they see anything, that is potentially a threat, they will call out. We always decide on what the word is going to be,
Okay.
the alarm word. Sometimes it's zebra or something odd like that you wouldn't expect to hear, right? So they'll yell that, and then they will start running to where the bird is, especially if it lands. That's when they're most vulnerable.
They're running toward the bird you're exercising, or the bird that's might be going to bother the bird that you're exercising?
Towards the bird we're exercising, because most often what's going to happen is the bird will land, and then the bird will come out. The wild bird will come out of the trees and go for the bird that's on the ground. And so the volunteers, and sometimes staff are out there too, if they see a bird, we're running, yelling, clapping our hands, but we're running towards the patient that's on the ground to try to distract the raptor. It doesn't happen all that often, but again, we're preparing for the worst, as you said, so that we can handle any situation out there.
So I'm just thinking, and a couple things. Another benefit to flying outside is they get to work in the real world almost, right? They have the drag from the line that's appropriate for their species, basically. And raptors, of course, catch their food with their feet, so they're carrying items, right? So that's a partial benefit, and the drag might act like when I'm training with weights or something. And then the wind and being able to work with the air, because that's what they do in the wild. And I would imagine that really can help you. I look at the mechanics and how they're flying, and if they're ready, or how much they're ready. Would that be a correct assessment?
Oh, definitely. Sometimes what we see on a Creance will help us to decide that maybe the bird isn't even releasable, when in an outdoor enclosure it looks normal. So things like the inability to turn in one direction. Maybe every time they're out, no matter what direction the wind is, they're only able to turn, let's say, to the left. Maybe they had a wing fracture on the right, and so they can no longer turn to the right. Also, sometimes with head trauma, we've seen interesting things, like where a bird with, let's say, either partial visual loss or a bird that we didn't realize has central blindness in one eye. You'd never notice that in a confined setting, but when you put it on a Creance, that bird will only, again, fly in one direction. It's not going to fly where it can't see. So there have been several times where we have picked up on these more subtle things from flying a bird on a Creance outside.
Wow. Wow, that's amazing. And I know that there are folks out there that can't do Creance flying. And at some point we'll talk a little bit more about pen flying and what that looks like and how to make it as accessible as possible. But those little subtle, maybe unexpected things with Creance flying is certainly advancing our raptor rehabilitation as a whole. So that's wonderful. One of the other pieces of, I don't want to call them equipment because they are so much more valuable, but the trained volunteers that you have that go out, retrieve the birds, put the equipment on, but what kinds of observation skills or what kinds of things are you having them do? And then do they have to write something down? Do they have to just verbally tell? I mean, how do you figure out that this bird is, over the course of several times, isn't turning to the right, for example?
Right. So since we have so many raptors that are being exercised at the same time, we really do depend on our volunteers to evaluate the birds, and they have to record their findings during every exercise session. And what's really nice about that is we have different crews that are flying the same bird on different days. So once you see that, there's a common thread here, that this group said the very same thing as this group, then it kind of eliminates a little bit of the subjectivity. And so then we know, okay, there's really something going on here. And then usually a staff person, one of our rehabilitators, will go out and observe. So basically the volunteers are taught a lot about what mechanics should look like. They watch a lot of videos so they know what's normal. And the thing is, we don't tell them what is wrong or what was wrong with the bird because we don't want to bias them.
Oh, that's so interesting. Oh, okay. Sorry, I interrupted you, but wow, you don't tell them what was wrong with the bird.
Correct. Because we want their unbiased observations, right? And if you tell a person, it had a right wing injury, what's their mind going to do? It's automatically going to look for something that's related to the right wing.
Right.
Right? So, we will tell them if they ask, and certainly as the bird is recovering and getting ready to go, we'll tell them. It's not like we're going to keep it hidden from them forever. It just, we just don't want them to be biased in their observations. But they will be responsible for evaluating the mechanics. So wing position, wing extension, as well as the arc of the wing during each wing beat. They look at the leg position. Is it, both legs should either be completely down because of the weight of the Creance, right? Sometimes that happens. Both tucked up. And sometimes you'll see where the legs have a strong shift to one side. So if they are down, they should be straight down, not shifted to the left or right. But sometimes certain injuries will cause a leg shift. So that's a really good observation. Also, sometimes one leg will be up and one will be dangling. So that's really important to know. So they're looking at the wings, the legs, the tail position as well. Most often the tail position should be parallel to the plane of the body. And even when a bird turns, it banks, right? And as it's banking, its tail is still pretty parallel to the plane of its body. Now, tail feathers can move independently, and there are some, minor tweaks that they do as they're regulating airflow to do different maneuvers. But in general, if you see a strong tail tilt down to one side where the rest of the body is more horizontal, that's indicating some type of mechanical weakness. So the volunteers are trained to look for that as well. Then sometimes you'll also see whole body position changes, like there'll be, the body will be slightly twisted, and it's really obvious when you see this. And it's the birds, boy, they have spirits of gold. They will try to power through anything. But sometimes when you have a body twist, their flight looks ugly. And so, again, it kind of indicates that there's a problem there, obviously, right, you'd think. And most often a body twist is accompanied by a tail tilt or a leg shift or something like that.
Okay.
And then the other thing we make sure that they look at is feather positioning. Are any feathers kind of sticking up oddly, especially in the wings as the bird's flying? Sometimes when fractures heal, if they don't heal in perfect alignment, which, let's face it, how many, even with surgery, are perfectly aligned, right, relatively few. But sometimes what that can result in is some of the flight feathers that kind of flip up funny during flight.
Oh.
And of course, we haven't even talked about the importance of the flight feathers, but flight feathers are important for creating, the motions of flight. And if they're not positioned appropriately, they can add to drag, right? And drag is going to make it harder for birds to gain lift and also to have forward thrust, right? So those are things that we want to know. And so the volunteers are very skilled. Obviously, it takes them a while. And so...
Yeah, I was wondering, how long does it take for them to become very proficient?
Yeah, when we have a new volunteer, we always have them work with an experienced volunteer or several volunteers, right? So that volunteer who's experienced can point things out to the newbie of the group. And just over time, observation skills will improve dramatically.
Right. And observation skills can be learned.
Exactly.
So a lot of people think that, I'm not a good observer. You can learn to be better. So
exactly.
Awesome.
Yeah. So pretty cool.
Very cool. So then the volunteer crew says, this bird's ready to go. Is there steps then that happen? I mean, do they have to take a video? Do they have to show staff? How does that work?
So most often when the reports are that a bird is ready to go, then a staff person, again, one of the rehabilitators, will actually go out and observe for themselves. So, it is really nice having most phones having cameras and even slow motion cameras on them. So, sometimes if something weird is happening, during a flight session, we will encourage, one of the volunteers to take a photo and then show us. But we don't depend on videos to determine if a bird is ready. We want to see it with our own bare eyes because that's a huge responsibility to make that decision, right? If a bird is ready to go. And so we don't want to put that on the volunteers at all because if for some reason they're not right, that's kind of a huge responsibility there.
Definitely. Well, before we get into kind of species differences on how they fly or how you choose what equipment to use, one of the questions that I was thinking about is how do you handle, or how do the birds handle, rather, any of the stress? Because I would think that this would be a little stressful to be taken out of their enclosure, put equipment on, walked out to the field, or driven out to the field, wherever that field is, and then exercised, not being able to get away, having to be captured again, flown again, that kind of thing, and then brought back. So how does that kind of fit into the whole plan?
Well, obviously, we try to minimize the stress as much as we can. We have all of the equipment ready. We have a head cover, which is either a light towel or a specifically designed hood for diurnal raptors. So we cover their head to reduce their visual stimulation. We're quiet when we're walking out to the field. We try not to talk too much. We try just to get out there, do our exercise, and bring it back. So we try to be prepared. But the other thing, too, that we have discovered through some studies is that the most stressful time for a raptor, and I'm just going to say for owls, because that's really the only species that we tested this on, so I don't want to extrapolate too much, but so in great horned owls in particular, the most stressful time is during the first 3 weeks that they're admitted. And so this also kind of follows suit with when we see cases of aspergillosis coming in species that are highly sensitive. It's when they first are admitted within those first 3 weeks. And then what seems to happen is that their bodies kind of come to an accommodation of the stress. And so there aren't any more physical issues that develop from that, as long as the stress remains kind of the same, right?
Okay.
And so we tested this by looking for stress hormones in the fecal output of great horned owls.
Okay.
And basically what it's shown is, there was a significant amount of the stress hormones when the birds were first admitted, but then throughout the entire rest of the rehabilitation, including the Creance exercise, it kind of stayed at a steady state. So we didn't see another jump up once the Creance started. And so we're kind of hoping, again, extrapolating from one species to many, but we're kind of hoping it's the same. And certainly we're going based on the bird's behavior
Right. I was going to say the behavior is telling you a lot of things as well, and probably, says, well, it's similar. We're seeing similar results after so much time, convalescing, and that's before they get, to the point where they're Creance flying usually. Interesting. Thank you. Thank you for that, because I know people would be curious about, because of course, a lot of times in rehabilitation, we're like, can we be hands off? Can we be hands off? And will that lower the stress? And I don't know if that's necessarily true. But we need to handle these animals when we need to handle these animals.
Exactly.
By the way, I just want to reiterate for folks that Lori and the Raptor Center have published an ebook on Creance flying. What is it called?
It's called Reconditioning Raptors, a resource for the Creance technique.
I like that. That's a nice title. Nice title. So we'll have places where you can find that book, and hopefully a couple tiny video clips so you can kind of understand a little bit more about what we're talking about. It won't teach you how to Creance fly by that video clip, but it will give you an idea of what we're talking about today and what it's all about. But definitely check out that ebook. It's a wonderful resource. 100 pages, I think you told me earlier.
That's right.
Yeah. And videos and other things that are like addendums that you can get if you so choose, depending on the species that you're interested in. So let's talk about species. What are some of the species differences that you have seen, either with how they fly or how you decide what equipment to use, all of those kind of decision points and interesting things that I would like to know?
Well, the type of equipment is really the type of Creance is what we're talking about, right? And that, as I alluded to earlier, is pretty much based on size to some extent. And also, a lot of it is also based on wing loading. So the birds that have a greater surface area for their body, they can gain lift much more easily. And so giving them extra drag is not a good thing, because they don't have the ability to take that extra drag to get lift. So for those species, we like to put them on the fishing line.
Okay. An example of those species?
Of high wing, low wing loading. So that would be like short-eared owls, long-eared owls, even great gray owls, northern harriers.
Harriers, I was thinking.
The birds that fly buoyantly. And also,
I've heard them described as like flying like butterflies.
Yes.
Almost.
Yeah. And of course, all the small raptors too. If we were to fly them outside like we do sometimes, the small owls, screech owls, northern saw-whet owls, merlins, kestrels, certainly Cooper's hawks, sharp-shinned hawks, those birds all go on the fishing line. And all that information is also in the resource. We go through a lot of different species and give Creance type recommendations.
Excellent.
But then after that, it really is pretty standard throughout as far as the equipment that we use. There are some species differences, though, when you're exercising them as to what to expect. And one of the ones that pops out to mind is with Cooper's hawks. So, the Raptor Center has gotten enough Cooper's hawks in now that we know that this is a Cooper's hawk thing. It wasn't just a couple birds.
It wasn't just a fluke the first 10, 20 times. It's, yeah. The Raptor Center, gets like, it's over 100.
Yes.
Like 150
over 100
or
Cooper's
something.
hawks. Oh my gosh.
A year?
When I first started, it was like 5. We were excited to see a Cooper's hawk because it was unique, it was different. Now it's like, another Cooper's hawk.
Another Cooper's hawk. We may have to have a whole nother podcast just on Cooper's hawks and the challenges with Cooper's hawks. But back to Creance flying. So Cooper's hawks and flying.
Yeah, so what they tend to do is they will exercise like 3 times. They'll go 3 full lengths of the Creance, and then they will refuse to fly. Right.
Okay.
Even if they're capable of doing it. And so
They're
what
like,
we've
this is not
discovered-
worth it. I'm not getting anywhere, or I'm tired, or do you have any? ideas why they do this?
I do. But let me tell you first what we have to do. We usually give them like a 1 or 2 minute rest, and then they'll do another 3.
Oh.
And so if you look at their natural history, these birds are sprinters, right? And they're doing very fast sprints as they're trying to, procure their little bird prey, most often in flight. Mm-hmm. And so their bodies are built for sprinting, right? So they have short, broad wings that create a lot of drag. They have long tails and long alula feathers, which are those feathers that come out of essentially their thumb, right, their wrist area. Mm-hmm. All of these things create a lot of drag. So it takes a lot of energy for them to fly those short bursts. And generally, when we're asking them, at least to start out, to do this multiple times in a row, mm-hmm. they run out of gas. They just can't.
They can't.
Right. So as the reconditioning goes on, we then see this occurring less and less, where they don't need a rest after 3. They can go all 8 and go the total distance that we're expecting without needing a rest. But certainly when they start out, that's what we typically will see. And it makes perfect sense, right?
It does when you start thinking about natural history and you look at the body mechanics. And like you said, the wing loading and all that just plays a huge part. And sprinters versus long distance runners, same thing in humans, right? They're going to be working differently to achieve that particular goal. So that is fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And you said something that triggered a question. Is you said we have them fly 8 lengths. Is that generally the amount of times you fly a bird? Well,
it totally depends on the size of your space, right? Mm-hmm. Because through studies, both the lactic acid study and then some additional studies that we did after, we determined total distance guidelines during any one session. Let's say for a male red-tailed hawk. Mm-hmm. So 1,500 feet was ideal for a male red-tail before the lactic acid would accumulate too much in the blood.
Oh, okay.
So again, that bird was then, after that point, was working anaerobically, right? Because its body was not giving its muscles enough oxygen to work. Mm-hmm. So any exercise after that point was really doing nothing to build up its aerobic capacity, its endurance.
Right.
So there was no point in doing it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You kind of measure the length of the field where you're flying, and then measure the length. The length of the Creance, and is that how you kind of? It's math. You figured that out. It is math.
It is math.
Simple math. I could figure it out.
Yeah. So in our space, it turned out to be like 8 lengths of about 150, to 200 feet that would then come close to that 1,500.
Okay. Oh, my goodness. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for that clarification. So that it's incredibly helpful. Okay, so Cooper's hawks, when you first bring them out, 2 or 3 times, then they set. They're like, I ain't flying anymore. And again, we talked about it's based on natural history. What other differences, whether it's with Cooper's hawks or other species you see?
Yeah, so some of the longer-winged, bigger-bodied birds, they can have, at least when they're starting, a harder time getting off the ground. And so what we do is we will give them a toss, and we'll toss a lot of other birds after their first flight as well, just to give them a little bit easier time gaining lift. Mm-hmm. But with the bigger-bodied birds, we have to use a different type of toss. So that they don't stall out. And so what we do is we give them what's called a toss from the hip.
Okay.
Where, the other birds, so when we toss them, it's more of a very light upward, forward motion. Mm-hmm. Right? If we do that to a bigger body bird, they basically put their wings out and they go to the ground, right? Because they don't have enough oomph to gain any lift yet. So what we do is we give them a toss from the hip, which is basically a backwards and forward. Sometimes we have to give them a little thrust to get that air flowing over their wings so that they can gain lift. So the type of toss that's required may be different. We also see that with a lot of juvenile birds as well. They
Oh.
don't know how to fly a lot of times yet, to really do all their maneuvering. And so sometimes we have to give them a toss with a little bit of forward propulsion to help them figure out that, oh my gosh, okay, I can actually use my wings and fly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it only takes a couple times until they figure it out. And then they're like, oh, okay, I got this. I understand now.
Okay, so the toss versus putting on the ground, that's also dependent on, how old you are and how heavy-bodied you are, and those kinds of techniques. So that's okay. That's amazing. Are there situations where you won't fly, exercise the birds on the Creance?
I mean, environmental conditions, outside
Yeah, environmental conditions. Yeah, that's what I was thinking of. Minnesota, we've got snow on the ground right now.
Right.
I'm thinking that kind of thing.
Yeah, for sure. So it all depends on the weather. If there's any type of precipitation, raining, snowing, we won't fly. We won't exercise them. High winds, we also won't exercise. So we have like a 12 mile an hour sustained winds, right? We can have wind gusts up to 15, and we just will let the birds go when the wind gusts aren't happening, right? But if it's going to be a sustained wind gust of 15, eagles can probably tolerate that, but most other species we won't exercise.
And it's probably counterproductive too when it's...
It is. Because they don't need...
you're trying... Right. You're not trying to get them to just fly in that kind of wind. You're trying to build muscle and get them ready to be released. And then they can fly however they want to.
Exactly.
Oh, okay.
The humidity, too, the temperatures play a big role. Okay. So, of course, in the wintertime, especially in January and February, it's just too cold in Minnesota to exercise much of anything, which is okay because we really don't release many birds in the wintertime. It's just too hard for them to go from, recovering from an injury inside, and then, we do acclimate them to the outside weather, but it's just too hard for them then with a snow cover to find food and really reacclimate, to an area.
Right. Right.
But eagles we do release all winter long, and we release them along the river where a group of eagles will congregate to overwinter. There's open water there. So that's one species that we do continue to exercise all winter long. Okay. However, our volunteers don't want to be out there either if it's, sub-zero and, bitter wind chills. So it's more for the people that we do it. The birds are already housed outside, so they're kind of used to it, but from the perspective of our volunteers, we won't.
Yeah, and another shout out to the volunteers because they are Minnesota hardy. There's no question about that. But there are limits. Do you have to worry about snow depth? I would imagine because you've got people the bird can fly over the snow, but the people have to run through the snow. Yes,
our eagle flight crew is in the best condition the entire year, probably by the end of February. And some of them will even bring snowshoes.
Oh, interesting. I was going to ask about snowshoes.
Yeah, if it's steep enough, they definitely will. Okay. The other extreme then, of course, is if it's too hot in the summertime. Hot,
sure.
A mixture of heat and humidity, right? We're not going to stress these birds by allowing them to overheat when we're exercising. And of course, exercise generates body heat. And so we will try to do our exercising in the early part of the morning, but I can tell you by some days, like by 10 o'clock in the morning, we have to stop. It's just too humid and too hot. And if you look around, there aren't many raptors flying at those hot times of the day in the wild either.
Right.
So there are some limitations for sure in that regard as to when we can actually exercise. And then also from a bird's perspective, we have a bird that we determine is ready for exercise, but we put it through a little exam each and every time before we take it out to exercise, just to make sure that nothing new developed that would prevent it from being ready for exercise on that day. So we check things like its weight to make sure that it hasn't, for some reasons, stopped eating since its last session for whatever reason. We check the health of its feet, its feathers, which of course are extremely important for flight, its carpi or wrists to make sure it didn't injure them in any way since the last time we checked them. And so if anything would indicate that the bird is not suitable for exercise on a particular day, we won't exercise it. We'll try to figure out the problem, try to solve it. Most often it's a management-related issue.
Okay.
If that's going to happen. But again, we just don't assume that if we put a bird on the list, it's good to go every single day.
Until it's ready for release.
And so what happens is, let me just explain, our flight volunteers go and retrieve the birds, and then they bring it into our treatment room, they get a weight on it, and a staff person does a quick visual. Okay. And that whole thing takes like 60 seconds. So it's not meant to be a long, drawn-out exam. Just a real quick check.
Okay. It's what I love about this whole process that we're talking about, it seems to me to be very holistic and very raptor-centric. So very patient-centric, which is, I think, is a lovely way to do raptor or any rehabilitation, is that you're looking at what the needs of not only overall, because you figured out through science and everything, what in general you need to do to get these birds back and ready, but on an individual basis. You're doing it very not only species-specific, but individual-specific. And along those lines, this is a general question. When you are exercising these birds, getting them ready to go, do you do it every day?
Good point, Gail. No, one of the exercise principles is recovery. And so what that means is basically when a bird especially is first starting out with an exercise program, you need to allow its muscles to recover from the previous exercise session. So muscles rebuild when you stress them and then the muscle fibers are torn down. They need time to kind of build back up, and that's usually a couple days. So when we first start an exercise program for a bird, it may be 2 days the first week, and it'll be 2 to 3 days apart. Again, allowing enough time for recovery. As they get closer, the week before, we may fly them, exercise them, 3 to 4 times a week. Because, we're expecting at that point they're going to be flying every day in the wild. But certainly to start, the first week or two, it's twice a week. Then we'll graduate to 3 times a week. And then right before they go, we may do them, 4 times a week. That's really important. That's one of the key exercise principles.
And when we talk about exercise principles, so recovery, definitely one of them. Are there others? I mean, there's, 5? 5, 6? What are some of the other ones that they must play a role, right?
They do.
Okay.
Yeah. So the first one is the overload principle. And what that basically means is that in order for muscles to grow, they have to be stressed a little bit from the amount of work that was put on them the previous session. So, it's like if you were going to start weightlifting, let's say, okay? You don't try to lift 50 pounds immediately, You'd probably start with 10 the first day, right? Or let's say you're bench pressing. Let's a better example. Let's say you're bench pressing, okay? You're going to start with 10 pounds, at least I would. Then maybe 20, then 30. You work up to the 50 pounds, and that's accommodation. You're allowing your muscles to accommodate to the heavier workload, but it's a gradual process. So you do that by having a regular schedule that allows for recovery. So the overload principle and recovery are 2. The third is the regularity. You need to do it on a regular schedule. You're not going to be able to bench press 50 pounds or even 100 pounds if you're only doing it, once every couple weeks. It's just not going to happen.
But that's what I want to do.
I don't ever want to bench press 100 pounds, Gail, so there you go.
I just want to do exercise one and done. But, I'm kind of getting to know that that's not exactly how it happens.
Yeah.
Heavy sigh. Anyway, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt, but
I know.
It's great information. Okay, so regularity.
Right.
Is
then
another one.
The fourth principle is balance, right? You want to have exercises that balance between cardio work and resistance work, right? Okay. And so from our perspective, cardio, we're giving them through the length that they fly, the distance of each flight. Resistance we can provide by sometimes changing the length of the line that they're on. So maybe they're not able to start with the 3/8 inch diameter line. So maybe we will start a medium-sized bird on the kite string, right? Also, they can build up a lot of resistance when they're in their free loft in between exercise sessions, right? So they can do things like, as you said, they can lift their food from the ground up to a perch. That is increasing their resistance, right? Because they're lifting a heavier load. So there are just things naturally as they're moving around in a free loft that can help to kind of create greater resistance.
Okay.
And then the last principle is you create that balance through a variety of different exercises, like I just mentioned, right? So that's why it's really important to allow a raptor, even if you're Creance exercising it, to reside in a free loft space where it can move up from the ground up to higher perches. It can move, between perches. It can take a bath. It can do all those natural things that it needs to do just to maintain a level of health fitness.
Right. And it just reiterates that a lot of the exercise program and everything also includes the space where the bird spends most of its time during this portion of its rehab where it's getting reconditioned. And I don't know if I even thought about that before, or if many people would think about that, but that's very interesting. Very interesting. Are there other pieces or parts we haven't touched on yet? I think we've touched on a lot.
Yeah, we really did. And, as I've said, it's kind of hard to explain this verbally. And, I'm a visual person, and that's why that resource was helpful for me as I was trying to teach our volunteers, just having something to look at. The other thing I will mention, too, is that the Raptor Center will consult with people who are creancing their birds, or even if you're pen flying. We'll watch a bird and we'll give an opinion on if we feel the flight mechanics are normal or if the endurance is good enough. And certainly all people have to do is just take a video and send it, my way, and I'm more than happy to look at it, or one of the other rehabbers can look at it and voice an opinion. Because that is hard, especially if a bird is not perfect. How do you know if it's good enough?
Right.
Right. That's the hard part,
is the question.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Because let's face it, our goal is to get them 100%, but how many actually reach that? It may be 98, 99%, sometimes it's 90%. And, the question is that indeed good enough? And there's so many considerations which go into that decision. And that would be a whole nother podcast is release, right? How do you determine really if a bird is ready? And that's just a whole nother topic.
Right, and this is just one little tiny part of that whole the whole set of considerations for release.
Exactly.
So again, the ebook resource that we've been talking about is called
Reconditioning Raptors, a guide to the Creance technique, or a resource rather for the Creance technique.
I wanted you to say it again because I knew I was going to mess it up, and it is a lovely title, and that is available through the Raptor Academy. Is that correct, or where do you find that?
Correct. So it's through Raptor Academy, which you can find on the Raptor Center's website.
Okay, and that website is
www.theraptorcenter.org.
.org. And we will have, again, these resources on the podcast website. And so you can find them there. And we may have some links in the show notes and that kind of thing for this. And you may want to check out the Raptor Academy. And if you just put that in your browser, it'll come up through the Raptor Center. And there's a lot of courses on rehabilitation of raptors, including, if I'm not mistaken, there's some stuff on reconditioning raptors in there, isn't there?
Okay, yes. There's also a 6-week course that we were teaching just on reconditioning raptors that I have converted into a self-study. So you don't have to wait for the course to be offered. You can take the course essentially at your own leisure.
Oh, that's wonderful. Totally on demand.
Exactly.
So you don't have to, once a year, have a chance to get into the class. You can do it when you start getting ready to Creance fly and recondition raptors for release. So that's amazing technology. It's exploded our world for education and training.
The reconditioning is so very important. You can have the most experienced medical care done. You have the most experienced veterinarians who do the most amazing work. But if you don't put as much effort into the reconditioning, all that work is really going to be for nothing because the birds are not going to survive. They need to have strong muscles, they need to have the endurance, and they need to have the maneuverability to do what they need to do.
And that's what this is all about, right? Getting them back to the wild doing what they need to do in the best way possible. Lori, thank you so much for being with me today. And my mind has been exploded, expanded, all kinds of stuff on the different things that we can do to really help make these birds that have had interrupted lives, that have to come into rehabilitation, get back out to the wild and at a level where they can do what they need to do out there. Next episode, I talk with one of my go-to experts on eastern cottontail rabbits, Laura Davich-Jetta. Rabbit hemorrhagic disease, or RHDV2, tops our agenda. She explains this devastating disease's implications and what this means for wildlife rehabilitators who work with rabbits and hares. Please join us for this incredibly important topic in episode 13. This was another episode of Wildlife Rehabilitation from Rescue to Release. We're glad you joined us today. Wildlife Rehabilitation from Rescue to Release is a production of Partners for Wildlife, working hand in hand with wildlife rehabilitators and veterinarians to improve the welfare of orphaned, ill, and injured wildlife. Our executive producer is me, Gail Buell. I'm the Partnership Coordinator for Partners for Wildlife at the University of Minnesota, College of Veterinary Medicine's Raptor Center. To learn more about the Raptor Center and Partners for Wildlife, visit raptor at umn.edu. Our producer is Kurt Clockey. Are you interested in becoming a licensed wildlife rehabilitator? Visit the National Wildlife Rehabilitators Association website at nwrawildlife.org for resources to get started. And remember, if you do find an injured or orphaned animal, please contact a licensed wildlife rehabilitator in your area. And that's our show. Hope you'll join us next time.